Welcome to Political Trade Secrets, an inside look at campaigns and politics, where we pull back the curtain, look under the hood, and investigate all aspects of politics and how elections are won. Now, here's your host, Dustin Olson.
Pollster and host of the Political Trade Secrets podcast, Dustin Olson.
Dustin Olson.
Dustin Olson.
And Dustin Olson, pollster at American Pulse. They work for both Republicans and Democrats. And he hosts a podcast, Political Trade Secrets. Oh, we love that. We like that podcast.
Now, from Washington, D.C., is pollster Dustin Olson.
Welcome to Political Trade Secrets. I'm Dustin Olson. I'm your host. Also, I'm the managing partner at American Pulse Research and Polling, and we just released a new survey earlier today, and it's on Iran, on the Iran situation, on the ceasefire, really gauging what public opinion is at this point with so many world-shaping events happening in the last few weeks. You know, it's never a dull moment, but we thought it would be important to do that, and I'll get into actually why. You can go to pollingclub.com to get access to that entire survey and get all the insights. We'll go through some of them, but there's a lot of interesting stuff from the partisan breakdown on things to you name it. It's really quite illuminating. So before we move on, though, also, if you go to pollingclub.com, you'll be able to suggest questions for future polls, as well as get other insights from not just our polls, but other people's polls. We will usually put out information about that, analysis and whatnot. So please go to pollingclub.com to check that out. Additionally, if you like this content, if you're interested in learning about political trade secrets and polling, other things, you know, what we try to do here is pull back the curtain on politics and how it actually works. And a lot of it isn't the way you'd like it to work, but actually how it works. And we like to pull the curtain back on that. And you can go to like us on YouTube, X, Facebook, any one of the podcast platforms. Follow us, and you'll be able to get any of the new episodes that are coming out anytime, and we really do appreciate that. But first, I'd like to get to why we actually decided to do this survey. And again, if you go to the website, you can download it. It's quite extensive, and this is in black and white, but it's actually in color if you go and check it out. We have crosstabs on everything. Very interesting. But on Monday morning, I was on SiriusXM's POTUS Mornings with Kent Klein, who was the guest host that day, and they wanted me to kind of go over all the current public opinion. We just had the bombings on Saturday, all the activity over the last 2 weeks with Israel and Iran, and they wanted to see what public opinion was. And I did my best to find what good information I could, and I found that actually there was not very much out there. It was either people who were pushing an agenda or really just not very good quality survey research. So it was really hard to actually tell, but there's a few things that came up. And I thought I'd play a clip from that with my conversation from Monday on POTUS Mornings on SiriusXM. I think the best poll in the last few weeks that came out on this was the Harvard-Harris poll around June 11th to 12th. They were probably they went the most in depth. And then since the actual strikes from Israel happened, JL Partners, who does polling for the Daily Mail, they did a decent poll that's multimodal with some telephone interviews, and they have some good questions that I think are more pertinent to right now. But the one thing that's really clear across almost all of those is that Americans feel that the red line is that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. 85% of Americans in the Harvard-Harris poll, with 86% of Democrats, 85% of Republicans, 85% of independents, all said that Iran must not be allowed to obtain nuclear weapons. So that was the initial thought. Now, this was Monday morning, and we had not had the ceasefire yet. And but it was really clear, like with the two good polls, Harvard-Harris had done an in-depth poll a few weeks back, actually before Israel began their campaign in Iran. Then I went to JL Partners, who James Johnson will be a guest on the podcast soon, who's another pollster. He's British, used to work for the conservatives and was at 10 Downing Street. He'll be on to talk about some of the things that he's seeing in polling right now. But they had done a survey last week, a flash poll, to see what people thought about the current situation when America had not gotten involved yet. So that was, both of those things made it very clear that really there is a red line. The Americans believe that this was something that that could not happen. We could not have Iran have a nuclear weapon. But there's also some other things that were clear in the surveys, which was that people liked the diplomatic efforts that the Trump administration had been pursuing, even though it hadn't yielded anything and they actually didn't expect it to. So with that, here's another clip from POTUS Mornings.
Now, one thing that is interesting, I thought, from the Harvard-Harris poll, they asked a couple of questions about President Trump's negotiations with Iran before all this started. And 60% supported President Trump opening those direct nuclear negotiations with Iran, though 45% believed it would result in no deal at all, and only 32% thought it would come up with a good deal. So it's interesting that Americans, they supported the diplomatic efforts, but they also didn't think it was going to yield anything. So I think the fact that the administration did try to take that route to start and then ended up in this place, that does follow what the public wanted. At least before all this happened. They can change their mind, of course, but it seems that they've actually threaded the needle very well, in my opinion. People say they do not want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and also they want to have diplomatic efforts as well. And that's exactly what Trump is trying to do. Now, is it possible? I mean, it's hard to imagine you bomb somebody and then you open up discussions, but it seems to be that's where the American people are. And the Trump administration is trying to follow that.
Now, I don't know if it's funny or not, because it's, this is really important stuff, but just, hours later, it actually turned out that bombing and then really forceful diplomacy actually resulted in a ceasefire, which was shaky at first, but seems to be holding, which is pretty amazing. So I thought, we have to get in the field. No one's done a real survey to really figure out what's going on here. We've now had a couple of big events happen. Let's find out where the American people are. Also in that interview, I said what I expect is that things are going to get pretty polarized, but you're going to find out when we go through our survey. That's true in some cases, but it's not 100% true. There are people that are going to say everything's bad no matter what if it's Donald Trump. But it is interesting, and I think we did answer that question: is has Donald Trump threaded the needle at this point? We're going to find that out as we go through the survey. But at any point, we're on all sorts of different platforms. I think we are on 7 to 10 different social media platforms and profiles. So you might be watching on X, you might be watching on Facebook, you might be watching on YouTube. Wherever you're at, you can feel free to post in the comments or in the chat, and that all comes back here, and I can actually see what questions or comments you have and be able to respond to that during the show. If you want to ask any questions, I can actually go in and look at the survey. If there's anything specific that you're interested in, I can answer that and give you my thoughts on it. So without further ado, I would just like to point out the overall takeaways. So we did, we asked lots of questions. It was really focused on Iran. It really, a couple of big takeaways, though, that the public views Trump more favorably now after the events of the last couple of weeks. They approve the strikes on Iran's nuclear program. You've seen all sorts of different stuff coming and going on different media. It really is based on what agenda people are trying to push. But it's a clear majority support his approach, both diplomatically and then militarily. And then specifically just on the military strikes, people are supportive. And people do think that this projection of strength will deter America's adversaries. And there's a couple of other big insights that we will get into a little bit more as we go through here. But a couple of things that are pretty interesting. So the next thing that I wanted to share here is that our survey found out that people do think that he's threaded the needle on being forceful, on taking decisive action, taking military action that was limited and specific. That was one thing in the previous surveys before anything had happened. People were more likely, if you whenever you do a poll, the way you word a question can have a big impact. And when the questions were more nebulous and general, military operations without specifics, people were generally opposed. But if someone's asked a question specifically about airstrikes against nuclear facilities, which some people had asked those questions, the support was stronger. So what we found was that general approach of the forceful and the diplomatic has won support for Donald Trump, as you can see in this graphic right here. So he specifically, as at about 56% of voters approve of Trump's efforts to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, including 37% who strongly approve. It's only about 39% who total who disapprove of this effort. So that's the biggest takeaway that I would say, and something that you can actually hang your hat on. That this is also interesting. And later on, we're going to talk about the president's job approval. This is higher than his overall job approval, which means that there's a group of people who don't necessarily approve of President Trump, but they approve of what he's doing on Iran, and that comes through in the numbers. So that's the first big takeaway that I have there. Next big takeaway that I saw is that specifically when you went beyond just his approach and strategy for Iran, that people actually specifically also approve of destroying Iran's nuclear program or these three facilities. And you can see the results there, 54%. We have specifically 53.7%, and only 39.3% disapprove of that. And it's interesting, actually, we asked this question at the beginning of the survey, but we also came back to it at the end. And at the end, after hearing some of these different topics that we're going to go over here, that actually jumps up to 57.3%, meaning that the more this is actually talked about, the more people are supportive of it, the more they know about what was going on, about details, that it actually increases support for these airstrikes. Now, something that I think is important context in here, if you go to pollingclub.com and you download the poll, you can actually go through it, and you can do so in depth like this. And one of the questions we asked is, do you think that if Iran were to get access to a nuclear weapon, would they use it? And 71% of Americans said yes. So on this question, people backing the destruction of these nuclear facilities, there's some clear context, background, in the back of people's minds. They are concerned that if that were ever to happen, they do believe, and this is bipartisan across every single demographic, 71% of Americans believe that Iran would use a nuclear weapon if they got access to it against the United States or its interest in the region or around the world. So that's a pretty big deal. Another thing that's interesting in the background is we asked the question, do you think the country is more or less safe with President Trump than we would be if Biden or Harris were in the White House? So this is also important context, because there's an alternate universe where Harris becomes president. What's the world look like? And voters seem to be more split on this, but a clear plurality. 44.4% say that the world is more safe with Trump in office, and 41% say that it's less safe. It would be less safe with him in office. So other answer is or stayed about the same. That's 10%. So between stayed about the same or more safe, it's 55.5%. Now, I probably put myself in stayed about the same. There are a lot of problems that happened over the last few years, and I don't think those are all wrapped up and tied off with a bow and everything else. So I don't think that that's necessarily been fixed at this point. So that's some of the stuff that's behind it, and I think why there's actual support for the military action of last weekend, which, based on some of the stuff you've seen, there's a CNN poll. One of the things that's interesting, there's what I call sample sleight of hand that's happening out there with polls that I believe are, in some cases, just people trying to do cheap chasing of headlines, where they do a 100% online panel survey, which is the cheapest way to survey people. It's just people doing online polls. People are paid to do it. And if you do a survey that's just of adults who are in the country, but they're not registered voters, they're not likely voters, it's just people who happen to be in the panel, the online panel, who are adults. They get to answer questions. This is not the American electorate. And I mean, there might be illegals in there. There might be all sorts of non-registered voters or non-registered folks. That is what most of the polls that are getting pushed out there. So those usually cost about half as much to do just adults. So that's one reason to do it. It's also traditionally, it's doing that is always gets you poor results for Republicans. So that is another reason to do it. If you want to have the survey be negative towards a Republican, that's a good way to do it. Whereas registered voters and likely voters is a little bit more the people who are engaged and people who are actually going to be deciding the direction of the country. So in my opinion, that's one of the things that's been happening. And you have some of these polls that last fall, they're doing a likely voter or registered voter survey. And now today they're doing an adult survey. That makes you wonder, are they doing that because it changes the results? Are they doing it because they're cheap? Like, what is it that they're actually doing? So that's part of what's going on with some of the surveys that are out there. But the CNN one, I think, is one of those. I'm not sure which way they were going on that, but I have my guess. All right, going on to the next insight. This has been talked about, and we've done this question in different forms for a couple of years now. So following October 7th, we did a huge landmark national security survey on border security, foreign affairs. And one of the questions we asked was, do you believe China, cartels, terrorists, other foreign actors are exploiting the broken border? We didn't use the term broken border, but the situation at the border. And this was, just a little bit past the halfway point of the Biden administration. And 65% of Americans said, yes, absolutely, this is a concern that they had. So we wrote a question that was similar to that, used a lot of the same language, but we included specifically about foreign adversaries like cartels and also possible sleeper cells. And this is pretty consistent over 2 years. It's within the margin of error. 61% agree that cartels, sleeper cells, and other foreign adversaries likely exploited the Biden administration's open border policy over the last 4 years. And this is a real concern that people have, and also is in the background. They believe that Iran would use a nuclear weapon if they got access to one. They believe that we are vulnerable because of what happened at the border over the last few years. And there's some anxiety about that. And this is all beyond politics. So there is some bipartisan consensus that we're seeing in the survey, which is shocking in this day and age in American politics that you can have that kind of consensus. The 71% saying that they believe that Iran would use a nuclear weapon if they got access to one. That is about the closest thing to consensus that you can find in America today. And the concern about the border and how it's made us vulnerable is not far behind that. So very interesting insights there. Going on to the next one. So you might ask, always, because things come back to politics, how does this affect American politics? And we asked the question, do these events make you view President Trump more or less favorably? And, even in this polarized world, this is a big number, 51% said that they view him more favorably because of this. And I have to say that I was actually quite surprised. And this is the part that's most interesting, though. Only 33.7%, so basically 34%, said that it made them view him less favorably. So only about a third of voters were actually willing to say that this made them view Trump less favorably. And that means that even a lot of Democrats who do not want to say anything good about him, they didn't, but they didn't take the opportunity to say that they view him less favorably because of it. So that follows on to the next question. We asked just the general job approval. And in our survey, he's at nearly 50% in his approval. So I believe it's 49.7 or so that he has support. So that's a pretty big deal that that's where he's at. You've seen lots of polls that have him really low on his approval, and then you have some that have had him about where we have him or a little bit higher. I think a lot of that has to do with the sample, that sample sleight of hand that I was talking about. The ones that have him in the low 40s are all these cheap online polls where they're only surveying adults, not Americans, not necessarily, they're not registered voters. It's just people who happen to be within the United States when they take the survey. So that's pretty crazy. But those polls are usually towards the low 40s or even high 30s for approval. The ones that have registered voters to likely voters, they're usually in the mid to high 40s to, in some cases, over 50. But this is where we see it, and I think this is pretty accurate, and possibly may not even be the ceiling of where things go. So that's a general kind of some of the big takeaways from our survey, which again, you can go to pollingclub.com and you can check that out. And you can go to anywhere, Facebook, YouTube, X, subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, other places to get this kind of information. But if anyone has any questions, I can answer some questions about the survey and what people think is important on this. And I see a couple questions. Well, comments first. Thank you, President Trump, and our military men and women. And this person says that they approve and agree. So thank you for your comment. Z-Bay, that looks like an X profile. Thank you for your comment and checking that out. One of the questions that some people might be wondering is what the actual partisan breakdown is for the approval of the overall approach, and I'll just show you what that looks like. So we provide in all of our surveys, we provide crosstabs so that you can actually see where people are. So on the airstrikes, on approval of the airstrikes, we have Republican, Democrat, and unaffiliated. So there's been a lot of commentary because of people like Tucker and others who were not so fond of possibly taking these actions. And what I think is, with the political realignment that's happened over the last 10 years or so, there are definitely hawks and doves in both parties. And that has definitely shifted things. Now, that is probably mostly in the talking heads or opinion leaders or influencer kind of group. That's where you see that mostly. I would say from our survey, plus some of the better surveys like the Harvard-Harris survey, as well as JL Partners, my take on that was that the actual Republican base and Trump base were generally with him with whatever he thought was needed. And before all this kind of got into the political filter, I think Democrats are generally are also there and are continue to be there because they are concerned about Iran getting a nuclear weapon. So for strongly approve for Republicans, 71.6%. That's 72% strongly approve. And then somewhat approve, 14.5%. So this idea that there's a big rift in the Republican Party just isn't true. Now you go to the Democrat Party, the number one position there on the airstrikes is strongly disapprove is 46.1%. But that's kind of amazing to me that that's not actually over 50% with that group. You have a good 28.3% actually that approve of Donald Trump's actions to do the airstrikes on the nuclear program. So that's pretty surprising. And then when you go to unaffiliated, which is what we call them, or independents, the overall approval for them is about kind of what you would expect. It's 49.3%, so it's pretty evenly split. And then you have about the same on the other side. So that is generally where things are at. Republicans are more supportive of the airstrikes than Trump voters. So we also have a crosstab. You can't really see that very well since it's in grayscale, but we have a crosstab for Harris versus Trump voters. So we asked people who they voted for in 2024. And on that, for Trump, strongly approve, it's 65.6%. So you see, he has a lot of independents who voted for him. That's probably where that difference shows up. So that's interesting. And then when you look at Harris voters, it's about the same. It's 46.5% were strongly disapprove, where it was 46.1% on the other one. So that's an interesting just kind of breakdown as to how the crosstabs work. I see we have another question here. Do you think the media coverage this week is having an effect on public opinion on the subject? Absolutely. One of the reasons why we fielded this, we put it in the field. That's our term for it, fielding it. We started conducting the survey right after the ceasefire started on Monday night. Then there was a question, is it going to hold? So there's been like a fluctuation of news coverage that's happened during that time period. And I think that it probably has fluctuated, but by it being in the field 3 nights and 3 days has provided us with the ability to have more of an even view of things. This is a snapshot in time. So 2 months from now, it could be completely different. Now, one thing that we do in our surveys, especially for our public surveys and for any of our clients, if they want to do this, we also track it. We track media consumption. So we can go back and we can look at where people are getting their information. So we ask people what's the number one place where they get news. We give them different kinds of places to get news. We usually ask a question about what kind of TV that they get their news from. We ask all sorts of demographic questions. We have also a fun question that we started asking a couple of years ago about, do you consider yourself to be woke? Most people do not. Just a spoiler alert on that one. And we also started asking questions about podcasts and news influencers, which I think is fascinating. And actually in this survey, our last big survey where we talked about this was about 5 months ago. And I think that there's been a significant shift in where people get their information. After the election and before the inauguration, we were approaching the point where legacy media had dropped under 50% for where people get their information, and podcasts and news influencers. So like, people like a Jack Posobiec or Tucker Carlson or other people who are posting things online on X and Facebook, wherever else. People are following them and they may not be listening to their podcast, and they have an impact. So anyways, those folks, the people who are getting their information from there regularly was 41%. That last poll up to 45%, at least once per month. And that's actually in this survey, it looks like that's jumped over 50% for people who are getting their information that way. So we are actually witnessing legacy media collapse. And your question's a great one, because the legacy media it does seem like CNN in particular is trying to drive opinions on this. I don't know, but it does seem like that's happening. And possibly Fox News as well is trying to drive opinions the other way. So as far as that goes, that has an impact, but it doesn't have the impact that it used to have, in my opinion. So what is your number one source for national and international news? Right now, the largest portion is cable TV news at 26.9%. That's 27%. So that's fascinating to look at. So there's a whole mix, of course, that goes into that, but that's still not even a third of the public that watches that. And then broadcast TV news, 21.2% say that's the primary place that they get their information. And then social media, 14.7%. And then like all the different online components is about 24% or so, between news websites, online shows, live streams, podcasts, and whatnot. So that's definitely changed. Newspaper, 3.7%. I don't know anybody who gets those anymore. Then interestingly, we go to which television news broadcast do you primarily watch? And Fox News is 24.3%, so it's still a powerhouse. You have CNN at 14.7% in this survey. MSNBC is 5.8%. You have Newsmax at 3.2%, News Nation at 1.5%. All of the network newses that used to be huge, right? These used to be the place where most news happened. NBC, CBS, ABC, none of them crack 9%. So we have 7.6%, 7%, 8.8%. That is quite shocking that's where those news programs are at this point. The media is definitely shifting very quickly, and whose voices people listen to is definitely changing. So with that's some of the things that you can find out if you check out our survey at pollingclub.com. I think it was very fascinating. I hope this is a public service for people to be able to look at what does public opinion on all these historic events over the last few weeks. What does it look like? We're approaching the weekend. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, says that it's possible that we have the Senate will have voted on the big beautiful bill, unless it happened while I was doing this program. But if that happens, if we get the final bills passed by July 4th, as they have this artificial deadline, and you start to have more trade deals, I have a feeling the events of the last few weeks probably make those happen, and we start to have a parade of those things. You're going to start having more foreign policy wins as well as economic wins, and I think it's going to be quite fascinating to watch over the next few months. Right now, in the last few months, Democrats have had the worst favorability ratings for their party in a lot of different polls. Republicans have, on the other hand, have had some of their best. In some polls, they have favorability for the Republican Party over 50%. I'm surprised by that. In our poll, we actually asked the congressional ballot question. We have Republicans down by about -4 when it comes to the generic congressional ballot, which might sound bad, but generally Democrats underperform where they are on the generic ballot by anywhere from 3 to 4%. So that means it's going to be a pretty tight election. So Republicans have their work cut out for them if they hope to keep their majorities, very thin majorities. So, but the economic news, the foreign policy news, all these things have a big impact on where people are. And it's really interesting. So feel free to post comments, questions to this episode anytime after we're done. we'll go back, we'll check them out. We'll incorporate that into future episodes. We have a couple coming up on some more polling things, as well as, we've had all these riots and protests and a little bit of what actually goes on behind the scenes and how those things actually happen. So with that, thank you very much for participating in this program. Thank you for the questions. And if you are watching this live, you can check me on Wilco on Salem News Channel this evening in the 8 o'clock, or actually 9 o'clock hour tonight. We'll be talking about the poll in further detail. Also, I believe tomorrow on Newsmax on Wake Up America, the great hosts Charlotte and Mark, you can check us out there as well. So we're going to be out there talking about this and hopefully giving people sense of what their fellow citizens think about this very, very important topic. So with that, thank you so much, and we appreciate your time today. This has been another episode of Political Trade Secrets.
Join us next time by subscribing on iTunes and get show notes and sign up for our newsletter at politicaltradesecrets.com.